Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He is the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
So let's tick through some headlines here, shall we? This idea that the president's campaign may have been involved with an analytics company that reached out to WikiLeaks matters to you because?
Well, because it's part of a pattern. We have the president urging the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's emails. You then have the Russians reaching out through intermediaries to offer dirt on Hillary Clinton. You have Republican operatives like Peter Smith, who are in touch with members of the Trump campaign like Mike Flynn, also reaching out on the dark web to people that he believed were Russians or those working with him believed were Russians. And now this leak or this link, which Julian Assange has referenced, where the data analytic arm of the Trump campaign is reaching out to Assange, someone that our CIA director has said is essentially a foreign intelligence agency and linked to the Russians. So yet another outreach by the campaign to an intermediary of the Russians, publishing material stolen by the Russians. So, yes, it's part of filling out the picture of this relationship between the Trump campaign and the Russians.
Now, the president is pushing back and saying if you want to get at money being spent to dig up dirt that's bad, look at Hillary Clinton and what her campaign did and didn't come out about soon enough, in his estimation, and the estimation of many others, about their funding of the research that went into the dossier, and that because she was part of the funding, it is proof that the dossier is bogus, which makes the investigation bogus.
Well, here's the thing. CNN, you all reported in January that this dossier or Fusion GPS hired Christopher Steele beginning back when a Republican candidate or candidates hired this firm. It was later taken over by the Democratic Party. So this isn't a particularly new revelation, although it is the first confirmation of the Democratic Party's taking over this effort.
And Hillary Clinton.
And Hillary Clinton. But look, here you have a Russian government, a hostile power, intervening to help a U.S. presidential candidate, and you have the other campaign learning about it and wanting to find out, is their opponent in league with the Russian government's illegal intervention in our election? I would certainly want to know that. I think everyone would want to know if their opponent was getting illegal assistance from the Russian government. So I think doing that opposition research, finding out if indeed your opponent is violating the law by working with a hostile power, is certainly something that you would want to undertake. Now, when the Clinton campaign acknowledged or didn't acknowledge its role in funding that, I can't speak to. But from the point of view of the investigation, the key thing for us is how much of this dossier is true. And we have been able to corroborate parts of it. Interestingly, Christopher Steele, this well-respected British former MI6 officer, may have recognized and known that the Russians were intervening on the behalf of one of the U.S. presidential candidates before our own intelligence agencies. And I also want to underscore something that Jim Clapper just said a moment ago, and that is when the intelligence community concluded that the Russians had intervened in our election and compiled that unclassified assessment, they were not relying on the dossier to do that. So I think this is a bit of an effort to discredit Christopher Steele, discredit the dossier, ignore how much of it has been corroborated already, and ignore the fact that the intelligence community is operating from a broad array of sources as a way of basically calling this all a hoax. And it just doesn't add up to me.
Well, those are almost the same words that are used, but in a very different context, by the head of your committee, Devin Nunes, obviously Republican here. Let's play what he's been saying about what he doesn't think adds up. All right. I'll just pause for dramatic effect. What he's talking about is that he believes that there's a lot of bogus nature going on here, that maybe it involves the FBI and using this dossier and unverified information to obtain warrants and open investigations against American citizens, including now the President of the United States, perhaps. What do you make of his allegations?
Well, I think, honestly, this is more of carrying the message for the White House. That's the message that the White House wants to convey. But the bottom line is, did the Russians intervene in our election? And the answer is yes. Did they make outreach to the Trump campaign? And the answer is yes. Did the Trump campaign make outreach to the Russians through intermediaries? And I think the answer very much looks like yes. Was there a quid pro quo? That is what we're trying to determine. Was there an agreement to cooperate or collude? And whether this dossier was originally funded by Republicans or Democrats really doesn't matter. What really matters is, what did the Russians actually do? What effect did it have on our election, and how do we protect ourselves in the future, because the Russians continue to intervene in our democracy?
What do you know about any warrants that might have been obtained on the basis of unverified information in the dossier?
Well, I can't speak to what warrants may or may not have been obtained. What I can tell you is, the key thing from an investigative point of view is not who began the dossier or what do we think about Christopher Steele, but rather what are we able to prove in terms of Russia's intervention? And on that score, I think we've made a great deal of progress, and we learn more every day in terms of the Russians' hacking and dumping operation, in terms of the Russian social media operation, and indeed the issue of the connections between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. And that's really what we need to get to the bottom of. I think, Chris, at the end of the day, what this is about is a technique you see often in criminal cases where the facts are really bad for the defendant. There's an effort to put the government on trial. So I think Mr. Nunes and the president want to put the government on trial because they don't want to look at the facts implicating the White House.
Well, that's
and
problematic
the Trump campaign.
when the man that you're defining that way is in charge of the investigation, as the head of your committee. And it raises the question of, when are we going to see what you guys have?
It is problematic, Chris, because he had committed to stepping aside and recusing himself from the investigation, but has not done that. And so that is a real problem that we have to grapple with every day.
When do you think we're going to see what you guys have?
I can't say. I think the investigations have a natural flow, in the sense that in some points they're at an expansionary phase where you're learning more and witnesses are telling you more and you're gathering more documents. I think we're still in that phase. And then you begin to narrow the issues that you're looking at and reach a conclusion. And we feel a real sense of urgency about this. The American people want to know, and we want to be able to tell them. But we don't want to prematurely and on a political timetable say we're going to finish by X date. I think the White House would love that, and indeed they're pressuring us to do that. But we can't give an incomplete report to the public if they're to have any confidence in it.
Now, while my next question goes to something that I had assumed was already investigated, new life has been pumped into the Uranium One situation in light of some reporting about the timing of contributions by Russian contractors to the Clinton Foundation. Your committee has oversight into looking into that investigation. What are your questions?
Well, here's the problem. This looks a lot to me like a redux of Benghazi. This investigation is starting, again, for a political purpose. This is another investigation of Hillary Clinton, long after now she's no longer a presidential candidate, no longer the Secretary of State. Apparently, there's more interest in what happened 7 years ago with Secretary Clinton than there is in the Russia investigation, and that's quite by design. I don't think we can do a good investigation if it's begun in bad faith the way this one has, because this now 3-committee investigation, or investigations the Republicans have launched with the acquiescence, we have to imagine, of the Speaker, was done without any consultation with the minorities on any of these 3 committees. So as we saw with Benghazi, when you begin investigation for a partisan reason, it leads to a partisan conclusion. Right. This deal was known about at the time, was controversial at the time. I'm not sure why we're relitigating it all over again. But I suspect it's much like the situation with Benghazi, and that is the goal was to prove that Hillary Clinton intervened to decrease the security in Benghazi, and we could never prove that because it wasn't true. Now there's an effort to show Hillary Clinton intervened in the CFIUS process to approve this deal, when there's been no evidence of that. But we're going to once again relitigate this, I think, for very political reasons.
Well, look, there's no question that there's political stink all over these investigations, and that's